Oxygen is a basic human need. It's a requirement for life. It's an element, it's a gas, it's odorless, colorless, and tasteless. It's essential to most forms of human life. In layman's terms, it is the air that we breathe. Room air is composed of about 79% oxygen, 79% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and just traces of carbon dioxide. What would happen if we do not receive enough oxygen? Inadequate oxygen is also known as hypoxia. If it's temporary, it's reversible. However, chronic hypoxia causes the body to compensate. If the body is without oxygen for 5 to 6 minutes or more, usually brain death will occur. What I will do during the course of this podcast is to define some of the respiratory terms, discuss the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory tract, as well as elements of gas exchange and the regulation of our respiratory tract. Let's start by defining some of the terms. Environmental oxygen is at 21%, and it is a gas. The amount of oxygen delivered to the tissues depends upon the amount of oxygen that actually enters our lungs. Perfusion is the blood flow from the lungs to the tissues, whereas diffusion is the exchange for carbon dioxide molecules or carbon dioxide molecules for oxygen, and it's a process that happens at the alveoli, between the capillaries and the alveoli. Ventilation is the movement of air in and out of the lungs. If inadequate carbon dioxide levels are in the arterial blood, then ventilation will increase. Carbon dioxide is the waste product of cell metabolism, and it's eliminated by the lungs. Remember that hyperventilation is an increase in the respiratory rate, resulting in an excess amount of carbon dioxide eliminated, whereas hypoventilation is a decrease in respiratory rate or depth, which can be insufficient to meet the body's oxygen demand or to eliminate carbon dioxide. I want you to remember the term hypercapnia because you will hear it over and over and over again through your readings or through your conversations in the healthcare arena. Hypercapnia is elevated arterial carbon dioxide levels. Hypoxia versus hypoxemia. Hypoxia is inadequate tissue oxygenation. It may be due to a deficiency of oxygen delivery or use of oxygen at the cellular level. Hypoxemia is a decrease in arterial oxygen levels in the blood. The respiratory tract is made of both the upper and the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract composes the nasal cavity, the pharynx, and the larynx, while the lower respiratory tract contains the trachea, the primary bronchus, and the lungs. The chest cavity or the thoracic cavity is a chamber protected by the thoracic wall. Inside the chest cavity is the trachea and the bronchial tree that leads to the alveoli. The rib cage and the muscles, as well as the pleura, heart, lungs, and the great vessels, are contained within that chest cavity. The trachea enters the thorax and then it bifurcates or it branches out into both the right and then the left main stem bronchus. The lungs are connected to the upper airway via the trachea. And of course we know that there are two lungs, the right and the left lung. The right lung is made up of three lobes, the right lobe, the middle lobe, and the lower lobes. The left lung has two lobes, the upper and the middle lobe. The bronchial tree is what it is. It's the trachea that bifurcates at the carina into both the right and the left bronchus. Each bronchus branches into smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches the alveoli. The last branch of the airway at the end of the exchanging unit of the lung is the alveoli, and we know that as the functional unit of the lung, where gas exchange takes place. The pleura consists of two layers, the parietal and the visceral layer. The parietal layer lines the entire thoracic cavity, while the visceral layer encases each lung. And the good thing is the pleural spaces are not connected between right and left. In the pleural space between these two layers, there's a potential layer, or a space, if you will. It contains a small amount of clear liquid or clear fluid to help lubricate between the two linings so that each layer will glide over one another. The parietal pleura is highly sensitive to pain, while the visceral pleura is not, and that is related to the sensory innervation. Distal to the terminal bronchioles is the alveoli, and that's where gas exchange occurs. There's about 300 million in an adult. The fusion of gases takes place in the alveoli, which is at the terminal ends of the lungs. Thinness of the alveolar walls aids in gas exchange, as well as a mass of capillaries that are arranged in close proximity to the alveolar. The work of breathing is normally a quiet, effortless process. But in truth, it's actually the effort that we expend to both inhale and exhale. If we need more oxygen, we generally will breathe faster, as well as increase the depth of our breath, or of the breath that we take. Or if we're unable to meet our body's requirements, our breathing will become labored. A person will tire if it goes on indefinitely. We know that children can breathe faster for longer before they get tired. When we are working hard to breathe, sometimes we'll need to use accessory muscles, intercostal muscles between the ribs, scalene, trapezius, as well as the diaphragm to actually breathe. These additional muscles can aid in breathing so that they increase our lung volume if we need more air, or if there's increased resistance to the ability to take a deep breath. But sooner or later, the person will become fatigued. Compliance is the ability of the lungs to expand as the air enters the lungs. With some disease processes, it will actually cause the lungs to have a decrease in their compliance. Airway resistance is the pressure of the air going in as it passes through smaller and smaller bronchi. Airway resistance will increase if the airway that the air is going through is swollen, or if there are increased secretions. Now, swelling can be from inflammation that's temporary, or it can be from narrowing of the airway. Tidal volume is the amount of air either inhaled or exhaled in a normal relaxed breath. It's not both, but generally speaking, we say that whatever we inhale, we actually usually exhale. It should be the same amount. It will depend upon a person's size, as well as, generally speaking, whether the person is a man or a woman. And we'll talk about some of the other terms related to the physiology of respiration in just a moment. To further define the terms, oxygenation is the delivery of oxygen depends upon the amount of oxygen entering the lungs, as we stated before. Ventilation is the process of moving gas in and out of the lungs, and it requires coordination of the muscles of the respiratory system. The major muscle involved is the diaphragm, and it is innervated on each side by the phrenic nerves, which exit the spinal cord at about the 4th cervical vertebrae. And that becomes important when you're thinking about people who are paralyzed. Perfusion relates to the ability of the cardiovascular system to pump oxygenated blood to the tissue and return that deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The amount of blood that flows to the lungs, as well as the amount of hemoglobin on the red blood cell, which carries the oxygen from the pulmonary vein to the left side of the heart and then out the aortic valve through the aortic artery to the systemic circulation, is all part of perfusion. Gas exchange occurs at the alveoli capillary level. The alveoli and capillaries are each composed of a single layer of cells. In diffusion, molecules move out of an area of greater concentration to an area of lesser concentration. Blood entering the pulmonary capillaries is low in O2, and the alveoli are high in oxygen. Therefore, oxygen diffuses from the alveoli, where the concentration of oxygen is high, into the blood where it is low. In the same way, carbon dioxide moves out of the capillaries into the alveoli. Most oxygen that is diffused into the blood is carried on hemoglobin called oxyhemoglobin, or the RBC. Only a small percentage is dissolved in the blood. The red blood cell travels to the tissue, and then it goes through cellular diffusion. The hemoglobin molecule on the RBC releases oxygen to the cells and absorbs carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the waste product of cell metabolism. It is diffused into red blood cells and is quickly or rapidly hydrated into carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then dissociates or breaks apart into hydrogen and bicarbonate. Hemoglobin buffers the hydrogen ion, and the bicarbonate diffuses into the plasma. Reduced hemoglobin, or deoxyhemoglobin, combines with carbon dioxide more easily than oxyhemoglobin, and therefore venous blood transports most of the carbon dioxide back to the lungs for exhalation in expired air. Respirations are regulated by both neural and chemical controls, and these are necessary to ensure sufficient oxygen intake and carbon dioxide elimination. Our rate and depth of respirations, as well as a balance between inspiration and expiration, is controlled by our neural control. Voluntary control over respirations is located in the cerebral cortex, where impulses are delivered via the respiratory motor neurons by way of the spinal cord. Autonomic control of respirations occurs continuously through the medulla oblongata. Chemical regulation maintains our appropriate rate and depth of respirations, and it's based on changes in the blood's carbon dioxide, oxygen, as well as hydrogen ions, which is the concentration of acid in our blood. Chemoreceptors are actually located in the medulla, the aorta, as well as the carotids, so that they will react to changes in the level of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions. They are stimulated, which in turn will stimulate neural regulators to adjust the rate and depth of inhalation to maintain our normal arterial blood gases. And this will happen, it can happen normally during physical activity or exercise, as well as in disease processes or in illness. Thank you for joining me on this podcast entitled Oxygen Ventilation. This is Susan Knowles from Cochise College Nursing.